Danny.
Erich.
We're back. And by we're, I mean a very confusing change to the hosting schedule across many different days. The listeners are still in mourning after the announcement that Omar was leaving Iron Culture. And, then they were in shock at the shift to where, Mass is taking a more involved approach to hosting Iron Culture and being a little more of that science-forward perspective, but of course still focusing on history and culture. And now we're coming back with another episode where it is Iron Culture presented by Mass, presented by SNA in partnership with Sigma Nutrition Radio. And we actually are hitting up against the limits of what the podcast server will actually be able to hold, not because of the multiple gigabytes of data files, but actually the length of the titles are starting to create too much of a problem. So if you're listening right now, just be grateful because we're not sure we can keep doing this with this podcast title issue we're running into.
Yeah, I think the next solution is we got to have like an appendix for the podcast title itself. People can download that as needed, and that should be our workaround. But yeah, sad news about Omar. I want to send my heartfelt condolences to all the Iron Culture audience in this very sad moment.
There's a lot of things going on in the world right now, and I think that's probably the most pressing one that everyone is thinking about. And in all seriousness, though, it is a big shift. And at the start of every episode, when I think about the intro, I'm going to have this pang in the cookies in my heart anytime I don't get to hear Erich and get to respond to Omar. So yeah, my sincere hope is that we get to have him on as a guest host here and then, or even just as a guest, because love that guy, and it's cool to be able to still text him and whatnot. But I love the podcast with the man. So anyway, Omar out there in Rascal Apparel Land, make sure you do your part. Buy some shirts; they're amazing. Help the man out. But today we do have a guest who has been a guest previously. Dr. Joe Klemczewski, welcome back to this very confusing set of 4 different podcasts.
Appreciate that. I should throw mine in there as well. I should record this and release it. So again, 5 or 6 titles.
Yep. Welcome to the NAMS Diet Doc, Sigma Nutrition Radio, presented by Mass, Iron Culture Radio, Sigma, Danny, Lennon, SNA podcast.
There we go. I think it's going to be a hit.
Yeah, it rolls off the tongue.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So, for those who are not maybe aware of who you are, Dr. Joe, I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to first state my history with you because it's all about me, but more so just to show, I think, just how important your influence has been in the industry. I first attended a seminar in Sacramento, California. I want to say it was in 2009 or 10. I can't remember which. I think it was actually 2009. And it was right around the time that 3D Muscle Journey was forming. And it was a WNBF Pro seminar. I remember Bob and Tina, who were still just promoters at the time before they actually became the presidents of the WNBF. I remember some other promoters, some other pros, yourself, were all presenting on contest prep. And I was really just seeing myself as a athlete who wanted to start coaching, who'd been a personal trainer for a while, and that had a profound impact on me. And I dare to say that I think maybe the career itself that I followed would still be here, but the way that I do it would not be as holistic if it hadn't been for your influence at that time when we were kind of in that super, I would say, quantitative sports science influenced phase, which was very important for that era where we had, it was a battle online just to get people to perhaps acknowledge that energy balance mattered and that counting macros was a useful thing rather than just following kind of strict meal plans. And most people, regardless of whether they're enhanced or natural, were following 12-week diets and cutting water and generally doing a lot of things that were heavily based in tradition that you weren't really allowed to question. So it's a very different face to the industry now. And I think people don't understand just how much of an impact you had for that to be able to happen. In the bodybuilding world, and this is something that hasn't changed, the way that information is highlighted and prioritized is based upon, does it come from someone who has been successful? And it's very easy to dismiss people even when they're quite logical, they have research to cite, if they don't themselves display success in the sport, which is fair enough. And the fact that you had coached and were coaching and continue to coach multiple world champions in the WNBF, that you yourself were a competitive WNBF pro at the time, you hosted a show and you were working with probably, I don't know, a third of all WNBF pros at the time and also people outside of the WNBF. It was very hard for people to really argue with your, like at the very least, that what you were doing wasn't at least sufficient to produce the kind of success. So the impact it had on me was tremendous. But I would love you to do a little bit more of an introduction to yourself, a little more holistic, not from the framing that I'll give. But I will just want to say that people don't know just how much of the current messaging they're hearing it actually has roots in your teaching and your philosophy, and that Lane Norton was actually your client, and his whole model of coaching, and he would say this, pretty much came directly from what he learned working with you.
Well, thank you so much. I do remember that camp in Sacramento, and I think you were still doing your undergraduate work. Yet I knew you, like it wasn't like you came up and introduced yourself blindly. I mean, there was some chatter on the boards, bodybuilding.com, that kind of thing at that time. This was, of course, pre-social media. And I want to say it's always a little bit funny as the story evolves or just more years get added to it, more perspective, because so much of that stuff was just reactionary and accidental. So again, consider a world, if you can, without even the internet, let alone social media. And so academia was a slow-moving animal, and there just wasn't a lot in exercise science, certainly nothing in sport nutrition or anything related to physique sport. So for me to simply be curious and inquisitive, why does this person look this way? Why does this person not? Why do you always wake up looking like shit on the day of a contest when you looked amazing 2 days prior? These are rattling around in my head as I'm at the IU Med Center doing a undergrad in pre-medicine, allied health, physical therapy. And then as I moved into my own WNBF career, as you mentioned, I wanted more answers. I needed to have more scientific validity to what I was doing, because I was at least adjacent in my biochemistry and chemistry courses to be able to find information like that academically, just not applied to bodybuilders. So I'm becoming this quasi bridge between the two worlds. And then once I had begun my physical therapy career and as a WNBF pro, I got swept up into writing for some of the magazines. I became the science editor for Chelo, which was the publisher to Natural Bodybuilding and Fitness. And then I just kept going in school for my own knowledge, ended up with a doctorate in nutrition. Probably around that time is when I was pretty seriously coaching, where it had become another accidental turn. It became a business model where people just wanted to hire me for that. And so pretty soon I have 300 competitive clients, and I have to do this as a full-time career, putting everything else to the side. And so from that step forward, it honestly took another 10 or 15 years for people like you, Lane, and so forth to come into the world and create an academic drive behind the whole set of principles, that even the questions to ask. I wasn't even confident at that time that there was a field of science to be had. I just thought we would always be borrowing from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and try to decipher and pull that into physique sport. How can we use that information? Now you guys have turned the entire world on its head, and you're doing research on physique sport. And that is not a place I ever thought I would be.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild perspective. And Danny, I think I would love to get your thoughts on this, because you speak to it a lot on Sigma Nutrition radio, where we've actually gotten to the point now where the problems are different because of this change. We often have people who are now, instead of going, oh, there's no access to the science and it's not relevant, they are essentially critiquing the science and bringing up how it's so confusing and it flip-flops. And now it's this thing where people seem to be overloaded with information from science, and there is so much of it that it is often frequently misinterpreted. I mean, you actually recently created a course with Alan Flanagan to where you guys are like, okay, there's a market to simply understand how to interpret research now. And I find myself, when I go to conferences or when I am, looking at the comments, where people are frustrated with how much science is out there and sometimes complain about how they're overwhelmed by it, which is just an entirely different animal. And I have to kind of hold back my own old manness and being like, how dare you complain about that? In my day, we didn't even have the internet to share these things, and here we are doing this and that, So I don't know. I'd love to get your perspective. You're a little more in the nutrition world and you have a different perspective on that.
I think it's really interesting what you highlight. And I think what is interesting about one of your comments, Joe, is that previous to this age now where it's so quick to find basically any study we want and people to talk about that in real time, that before there was a bit of a barrier, but it was also served a utility in that it was such a laborious process to get hold of research articles that when you did that, people were actually going to go and read them. The problem now is that there's so much availability, and that especially on social media, you are incentivized to be the person with the first reaction, the first hot take to something. And so if you speak the quickest as opposed to the most profoundly, often you get rewarded. And I think that's what happens where people won't read one research paper, never mind a body of research, and will want to make a comment about that as opposed to taking the considerable time it takes to go through a certain paper. And so conversely, this huge amount of evidence we have before us is also balanced against the incentives now to be able to put out information quickly, very confidently. And often, if you do that without actually diving into research, you're probably going to do better there. And so it causes a real problem. So I completely understand the perspective that people have of there is too much out there because there are many people unethically, let's say, waving around research and claiming it says one thing when really they haven't looked or they're just using it to back up a point they're going to make anyway. And so I think what we do with that is another challenge, but I think both of you have spoken quite well to these two problems that I suppose were opposing, but had both their pros and cons.
Yeah, Erich, if you could imagine this, my first doctoral dissertation, I printed out 3,500 abstracts at the IU Med School Library, printed out to take home. And then as I would walk on a treadmill, because I was in prep myself, I had boxes and laundry baskets set up all around my home treadmill where I could literally read and then drop them into the appropriate box. This one I can use, this one I can't, this one's in this category. And of course, I mean, literally, that was the technology. You didn't even have Excel to make a spreadsheet at the time.
Yeah, I will only do so much old manning and reminiscing to try to give people the view. But there was enough overlap between our arcs, because I want to say there might be a decade age difference between us. I'm in my early 40s. You're, I think, in your early 50s. But I remember my first personal training job at the YMCA when I had just gotten out of the Air Force and made a career shift. One of my first mentors was a licensed athletic trainer with a master's degree in exercise science and also he had a CSCS. And I knew the direction I wanted to go. This was around the time when yourself and Lane were on the internet, and I was like, oh, one day that'd be really cool. And my first bunch of clients that I inherited were part of a program called Silver Sneakers at the YMCA in Augusta, Georgia. And they actually had a partnership with a hospital chain to where their insurance would cover them to come work with this guy. And he basically said, I'm leaving. Erich, I want to give you all my Silver Sneakers clients, not part of the actual Silver Sneakers program because I wasn't like a healthcare professional. But, I had my I think I had my ACE certification, and I was, not incompetent. But I knew I was at the very start. Like I had I hadn't finished my degree yet, anything. And I'd only been probably training for 6 months, and I'd been lifting weights for like a year and a half. So it was really green, we're talking. And he gave me all these clients who stayed on post-Silver Sneakers program, which meant probably 10 to 20 people who had a high probability of not being alive in the next 10 years. Very high-risk clientele. I had some who had multiple strokes, had musculoskeletal limitations as well as cardiorespiratory limitations, and I was scared to death. This was a point in my career where I was wearing a beard just to look like I wasn't 22, because I'm working with people who are at a minimum 30 years older than me, right? And each day I would grab his CSCS textbook, and between clients I would photocopy and scan and print out, because I couldn't afford the book itself because it was like $300, right? It's a textbook, and I'm a poor student at the time. And I eventually, over the course of like 2 months, read my way through the whole CSCS textbook so I could feel more confident. But I was printing it out at work and trying to get away with that and, stealing company resources. So I definitely know kind of what that era was like. And I was just at the tail end where it was easier to read research by printing PDFs versus actually reading them on. So I totally get it.
Yeah, the NSCA existed for you. That was a big turning point.
That's a great point. Yeah, and it had some pretty decent reach as well. Yeah. So
yeah, I did my CSCS in 1994. They were pretty early on still.
Well, that was very forward thinking. I think mine was 2011. So yeah, it was definitely a few years removed. One thing that I want to bring up is just the importance of being able to look back. It's not just for us old people to feel validated and better, and to better understand the world and not just hide under our sheets. But I think sometimes if you have only seen the current iteration of the fitness or nutrition industry, it can be sometimes scary, or you can think something that is actually a repeatable trend might be this really interesting new thing. I think from a consumer protection standpoint, it's really helpful to know what has come and gone, because it wasn't necessarily like the linchpin game changer that some claim. Danny, there's a topic that you guys get into a lot on Sigma Nutrition Radio, and that is some of the exaggerated claims made around low-carb diets, their influence on health, and how with the modern social media platforms and the emergence of the carnivore diet and how that space has shifted, there are some pretty scary trends, and there are elements of it that invade the academic space. There's, of course, plenty on social media. One thing that I think is really helpful for people to understand is just how long this arc goes and how many times we've seen a cycle of interest in the low-carb community. So I guess I have a question to both of you. Dr. Joe, you've been around a long enough time, and I actually remember you talking about ketogenic diets in that 2009 seminar. Someone asked a question, and you talked about the physiology, and I found it very enlightening. How have you guys seen that space evolve, change, regress, move forward from when your guys' first involvement in the industry is? Probably start with you, Dr. Joe, since you saw this in the 90s with the Atkins diet.
Yeah, we were mentioning off camera a little bit the kind of the social science intersection of what we do. And that was something that I found resurging in the 90s. I think he kind of started it in the 50s and then the 70s and then the 90s. And there just seems to be this 20-year cycle. But now, because information is so rapidly consumed, so bifurcated by different channels and perspectives, you really have to have a pretty novel marketing spin to make something, have enough hook to stick. And so if it was just keto, or Atkins, I think it would be pretty boring. But, here came carnivore, here came paleo, then carnivore, and I'm sure there will be more iterations. And I think some people get a little bit closer with their concern with marketing novelty, such as, paleo, where at least you can eat, some starch and fruit. That gets you back in the bowl game of at least being tenable. But yeah, I remember back in those days. You're right. That was the big battle at the time. Was between just what you could see in popular culture, like the zone diet, and then here comes Atkins, and of course from Atkins came even things like Protein Power, which was a specific niche book in the same kind of arena. But all of those things have a little bit of nugget of truth in some of the physiology you can extract and some of the felt benefits, at least acutely, that people have. So it's cool. I mean, it's awesome. Like, you give somebody a diet and you can lose 10 pounds in your first weekend. Seems like that's going to be pretty effective. Sign me up. And so it's not until you get back into the research, as we were describing earlier, that you see, wow, no wonder I have failed on this 2 or 3 times, or no wonder the person who led me to this has now gained all of their weight back or has an eating disorder. So this is where, if we go back into what technology can bring us, you can search all of that information and history so very quickly. I'm assuming you guys in your generation successively, from me to Erich to Danny, it's now just normal that if you hear something that sounds a little bit spectacular, we all have enough of an inner skeptic that you immediately go search. And you find all the pros and cons and all the chatter around that. And yet there are still people who just don't do that. And so they're a little bit more taken by the marketing narrative than anything else.
Yes. Echo all of that. And I think there's numerous examples, whether that's low carb or otherwise, because certainly there is good information to be had, as well as poor information, as the same goes for any different type of diet or health claim and so on. To me, I think one of the interesting things is that there's almost been the academia and the messages people are hearing most in most mainstream / social media circles are going in 2 different directions. That is, if you look at the quality of research we have now on something like the ketogenic diet, on low carbohydrate fat diets, on a whole range of different outcomes, there's a tremendous wealth of evidence with some really well done studies. We have a really strong grasp of many ideas now that if we go back even a few decades, there were hypotheses, but maybe not good questions or good answers to. However, at the same time, the same things that people were selling books about multiple decades ago are still being used to market those books, because the marketing principles are the same. They know what marketing works. Create a problem, have a solution that is different to everything else, and typically everything else you've been told up to this point has to be wrong. And these kind of elements are going to sell you a popular book. And so while we have better evidence on all these types of diets right now, and better quality evidence and really interesting discussions to be had, if you look at a lot of the popular information the average person in the population might be exposed to, it is a lot of the times going to be incorrect. And that's kind of one of the things that I worry about, at least. But yeah, that's a whole other topic, I suppose.
Yeah. And it connects to what we said earlier, how truly it was, like, if there was a study on a topic that could be, made relevant to a lot of the interests we have in, like, the fitness, body composition, or physique sport realm, or really any kind of, like, quote unquote evidence-based realm, 10, 15 years ago, it was like this holy grail that you would bring and hold and share, and people were like, oh shit, they actually did a study on that. Everyone would read it, or at least kind of have like the in the know take. You're going on certain forums where people share full text because it's behind a paywall. This is before a lot of the ways that we have now, and before open science is even really a thing. And today, when someone does go through that hopeful process of being skeptical to where they actually do search, unfortunately, that's not necessarily what they find. They can find 20 studies on the topic. And if they go into it with a bias, or if they find a pseudoscientist communicator, or just a science communicator who's wrong, which happens all the time because everyone is trying to do science communication, who is not representing the overall body of the data or is not aware of the limitations, of a specific body of data or a specific research study, you can find, just because of the sampling variance and the nature of sports nutrition and sports science, where you have these small samples, a study that goes in the opposite direction of what the kind of true effect is when we meta-analyze it or do a systematic review or when we control for the appropriate variables. So today, it's this tough thing where everybody can hold up a PubMed ID and remain clinging to whatever pet theory they have or try to explain things away. And there's another layer of education that we have to do. Like, I never remember 10, 15 years ago having to teach things about the evidence hierarchy or teach things about understanding the research, because anything was better than just, hey, what did this guy say at GNC? So today it's these multiple layers. Okay, now you're probably unlikely to be the person who is skeptical enough to search and actually look for studies. You might go to do a Google search, but you're not going to be like, oh, I need to go to Google Scholar, and then I need to look at, Q1 journals, and then I need to look at position stands or meta-analyses, right? So if we get you in the door at all of looking for research, that actually doesn't even get us that much of a higher probability of getting correct information, because there are so many people now that science is popular who use science as marketing. And that is one change that I've been thinking a lot about lately, to where, okay, we have to think about how do we educate the consumer after they are considering of even looking at science as an avenue. And we're also in this era of science distrust, right? Which some of this feeds into. The studies are all flip-flopping. There's these things that tell me this and there's things that tell me that, and it always changes. Is chocolate good for me or bad for me? Screw science. There's no real good answer to what they're just gonna do. But ultimately, I think that's kind of the situation we face now. So, Dr. Joe, I would love to get your perspective on this. Do you see the current era as a unique period of information overload, or is it just the medium and the speed? How do you kind of help your clients with that? Because I know you're still interfacing with people in the real world who are regularly struggling with this type of thing.
I think it's one of the most important things that we will face as a species in this 100 or more year era, to the point where kindergartners in the Netherlands are taught how to discern fact from fiction. I mean, they are taught literally to be skeptical. Okay, kids, first day of school, you're here at kindergarten, you're 5 years old, the whole world is going to lie to you. Here's how to not get in that creepy white van of misinformation. And it's probably why, to be honest. So starting in my 40s, I went into this foray where I kind of pointed my canoe toward retirement, and I ended up doing a master's degree in social science writing. Then I did a master's degree in social psychology. Then I did a master's degree in social science. And one thing kept leading to another, but the through line of it all was I was just so struck by how we as a species will believe anything that we want to believe. We will believe it with no evidence. We will believe it with a mountain of evidence against it. And all of these cognitive biases are so strong that we're willing to literally walk off a cliff, intellectually or otherwise, because we just want to believe something. And it has really captivated me. So is this a big deal to me? Absolutely. Look at the election we just went through in the U.S. And what I have to do with clients now is continue, and coaches that we mentor and certify and license, is to show them how, I don't want to say endless that cycle is, but how deep it is. For example, I just did back-to-back research reviews on the topic of sugar addiction. The first one, I showed through a very competent meta-analysis how, through a biochemist perspective, the compound of sugar is not addictive. It is not physiologically addictive. Went through all the biomechanical pathways, all the studies that showed how you cannot get chemically addicted. Then the next week, I did another meta-analysis research review on exactly why it is addictive. But there was just a little bit of a semantical nuance between the psychiatric world and the physiological world, in the fact that it depends what you call addiction versus dependence. Because even if you don't have the neurotransmitter interface that that doesn't allow you to become chemically dependent, where you have withdrawal symptoms and you have to be put in a medically induced coma or something, or go through all of that. Like it all starts with that phrase, like, sugar's like cocaine. You can get addicted to it just like cocaine. And these researchers like, no, you can't. It's not just like cocaine. But on the behavioral side, it totally makes you act that way. Like, you can literally harm your career, harm your relationships, do all of these things, become completely psychotic because of your dependence, your behavioral dependence on sugar. So does it even matter? So my point to all this is, here are these meta-analyses by very competent groups in schools coming with what looks to be antithetical information. They want to persuade you to consider their perspective, and yet it's almost just two spokes of the same wheel. As in science, one of my favorite mantras is, it's never either or, it's how and when. And so maybe this applies. And to be honest, after I went deeper and deeper into both of those meta-analyses, I thought maybe this is just a point of evolution. Like, we are epigenetically, because of the sugar content of our food right now in just the last 100 to 200 years, maybe we are literally on our way to becoming a species that can become chemically addicted, but we're just not all there yet. Maybe just some people are, through epigenetics. All of that through one little, question: Can sugar become addictive?
It's a really interesting world, that specifically, and I think when people get kind of caught up on this one, that's exactly how I help to explain it as well. Like, okay, there's chemical dependence. You understand that. You can have, heroin withdrawal, but we also are happy to accept that you can have a gambling addiction, and you're not chemically dependent upon the slot machines, but behaviorally in the way it can impact your life. Same thing with many other behavioral addictions, if you want to call them that. And that kind of nuance is, I think, where a lot of people struggle. And I always think of, and this is why I want to talk to you, Dr. Joe, because I know you think about the way society creates things, right? Or that the way society operates perpetuates things or prevents a solution. We're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle with social media, and the fact that attention spans are getting shorter, and the fact that, like you said, Danny, first one to go, I got the reaction. It's not the best take, but it's the fastest take, and it will go viral, and it'll have more staying power. And then we're dealing with the bullshit asymmetry principle, where once a myth is put out there, tremendously more work needs to be done to correct that course, at least in the broader mainstream community, right? And there is almost these two parallel worlds of the kind of quote-unquote core evidence-based educated group of people who are knowing all this stuff and trying to get the right information, versus kind of the science-interested public who might listen to, the Huberman podcast, but not Sigma Nutrition Radio, just as an example. Or they like those certain guests on Joe Rogan who are sciencey, and kind of increasing their literacy is very challenging because of some of the structures that are in place, where a reel is not going to be sufficient. It's only 90 seconds. There's a character limit on the on X or the Meta platform Threads. Even YouTube now, we're seeing kind of the watch time getting shorter, and you have to do certain things. The clickbait titles and the thumbnail game, you've got to get the hook, like you said, Dr. Joe, before you can even give them correct information. And we don't have a good way of quantifying how many people decided that the hook and the clickbait were enough, and they don't even want to watch the whole video. So it is there's not clear answers to me, but I think it is telling that there are programs like in the Netherlands, for example, of trying to teach people at a young age how to tackle this stuff, because the consequences are very real and very prescient, as we've seen in the last 5 years as we went through COVID. And, I think it's when you bring up COVID or the election, people automatically, especially Americans, and this is one of my happiest things about moving outside of the States, is it's very difficult to have conversations with people in that polarized of an environment, because as soon as you start to state any position, their brain, you can see it, immediately starts trying to filter you into which category do I put you in, what camp, how do I perceive you, do we align, or do I need to be defensive, or do I want to listen to someone who's in my in group, and it's getting worse outside of the States, but it used to be a starker contrast when I first moved to New Zealand. Far more conversations where people disagreed politically ended in, oh, fair enough, versus you're never coming to my house again and we're not speaking anymore and I'm unfollowing you in the States. But people are starting to do that in other places. So it's a lot of these structural things again. It's not that I don't want to turn off my listeners or, oh no, like iron culture is left leaning or right leaning. I don't want to follow it anymore. That might happen. But the main reason I don't want to use some of these examples, or I'm fearful when I do it, is just because I know that it starts to turn off people's critical thinking, right? So when I say the COVID era or the election, I think the important thing to know is just that even people who don't have a position, they're not left, they're not right, they weren't sure about what was going on, if they wanted to find true information during that era, they really struggled. And I had family, I had friends across the political spectrum, across the different channels they would listen to, who could find themselves going, I desire to seek truth. I'm trying to get around my cognitive biases, and I actually don't know the answer. And I think I have a little more hope for the younger generation, believe it or not, than I do a lot of people who are my contemporaries who weren't raised in this environment. I think there's a lot of well-placed fear-mongering, I will say, where people are concerned about children being exposed to social media and fake news at a young age. And I think, yeah, but that is the world. We can't put that genie back in the bottle. And to be honest, by the time they're my age, they're probably going to be better equipped to, wade through that if they choose to, or at least we'll have scientific communicators and leaders than my era. And maybe that's, me and my rosy-eyed goggles, but I would love to get your gentleman's take on that. And, where do we see things moving forward, and how does that affect the nutrition and fitness industry?
I'll answer first just to keep us on the political theme, because that's always inclusive and fun and, normal. But I almost want to say your glasses are a little too rosy, because this generation feels just as much pressure to discard conflict and to insulate themselves in a like-minded group. So, for example, just this morning, I listened to a couple different podcasts, one extremely left-leaning, one extremely right-leaning politically, socially. And both sides, which included some very young people, maybe even younger than Danny, were completely accusing the other side of the exact same things. You're using fear-mongering tactics, and that's not even true. This is true. Then the other group is saying the exact same thing, and they're not being snarky. They're not doing it just for votes. They truly believe this with everything in them. And those are the people that I think are really at risk. I mean, you see, for example, staying with this election cycle, how many young people were swayed, right? I mean, you had 30,000 Taylor Swift concert goers registering to vote at a concert, yet who came out to vote were the young, uneducated white males as a demographic who voted the other way. 10 million fewer votes for Vice President Harris as for President Biden 4 years ago. And so all of these people trying to discern what's true, what's fact, what's not, everybody's still struggling with that because we only have so much time in the day. We're going to continue to listen to people, and that's the default. If I follow Dr. Erich Helms because I trust his opinion, you could tell me something that's wrong and I'm going to do it. I'm going to believe it because I've already pre-qualified my trust in you as complete inerrancy until you prove egregiously otherwise. And so we will start layering, speaking of hierarchies, we'll start layering in those voices that we're willing to listen to. So I would hope that younger people are more naturally inclined to verify, but I just don't see that yet.
Yeah. I have just as much pessimism, but I will not get into that now. I think I actually did want to pull back on a point that you made previous, Joe, that I'd really love you to elaborate on, because I think it's particularly important, but also for me is at the core of what we talk about with literacy, particularly in the field of nutrition science. And there's also some good examples I would like you both to talk about in relation to training and bodybuilding specifically. And that is that when we are evaluating studies or people are waving around studies, there are some situations where to particular studies or groups of studies that on the surface for many people may be contradictory can actually both be right. And Joe, you gave an excellent example with those two meta-analyses that are both correct depending on what context we're placing them in and how we evaluate those. There's a number of examples of this we see in nutrition all the time, that we could have two cohort studies that show different findings, let's say about red meat. Both are actually correct. They just have different population groups and different exposure contrasts. So depending on that context, that's what really the literacy piece is about. It's not being able to say this study is right or wrong. It's knowing what context they place in. I think that was a really important point that you made. So that's the first thing I'd love us to maybe put a pin in to discuss. And also that this process of sometimes there's this, when a new study comes out and maybe it's against the finding that we've talked about before, people would say, oh, well, all the old stuff was wrong, or, but you said this before. And really, that's not what's happening most of the time. What we're really doing is refining our understanding over time. And this has added a new piece. And yet we've had to change our position, but not completely discard it. So the example I use all the time is our understanding now around saturated fat. First, it was, okay, high amounts of total fat in the diet seem to correlate with increased risk of heart disease. It's not that all of that science was bunk science. It's that over time, we've been able to refine that and see, well, it wasn't just a total amount. It was probably a really high saturated fat amount was having this effect on LDL. And even now there's specific fatty acids that we can look at. And so we're refining that understanding over time. And I think what's happening now, and this is where I'd love both you to weigh in, is in relation to training and bodybuilding and all these discussions about different types of the number of total sets or volume that is best, different types of ranges of motion, and saying, oh, so all that stuff you told me before about volume was nonsense because now we've got this. No, actually, most of these new findings still fit in with those frameworks that you always talked about, but now we're getting this more laser-focused understanding of these nuanced points. And I think, to me, that's what literacy is when we're talking about the science here, not saying, oh, that one was wrong and this one was right, or that all that old science is nonsense. It's about understanding this, refining over time, and in the context each study was in. And so maybe with those examples that particularly relate to training or nutrition, if any come to your mind, I'd love both you to maybe share some thoughts on that.
I've got a good one if you want me to start. I think this is really helpful because you framed that so well, Danny. I really enjoy when new research comes out because it helps me contextualize where into the story the prior research fits. And he goes, oh, that makes sense now. I'll use the two examples you gave related to range of motion and muscle length as well as volume. So on the range of motion muscle length thing, if you start tracking back like the systematic reviews and narrative reviews and the kind of the meta science looks at what do we currently know, which I think are a great way for anyone who wants to explore a new area, is go find the first scoping review, systematic review, or meta-analysis on a given topic, and then find each subsequent one that are published in relatively kind of mainstream journals. And you can see kind of how that the slow arc of the turning ship of science is going closer to the appropriate destination. Some of the first ones on range of motion kind of hinted at, most of the time, full range of motion produces better outcomes than partial range of motion for hypertrophy, but except in these few instances. And it seems to be maybe that when they're doing the partial range of motion in the initial range of the exercise, when the muscle is longer, something else is going on. There was no difference in that study. And when we remove range of motion, we look at isometrics at different joint angles. When the muscle is longer because of the joint angle, we get better growth after an isometric protocol. Neat. But anyway, for now, we're going to say, full range of motion tends to, on average, produce greater hypertrophy. But then we get to the modern era and we see, oh, hold on, range of motion is at least mostly explained as far as its influence on hypertrophy on does it contain the length and position, and then does the individual exercise produce a relatively high challenge, if you will, to put it colloquially. Is the resistance curve or the resistance profile of the exercise challenging that muscle when it's at a longer length? And if we cut off, that portion of the range where the muscle is short, or if it's an exercise where there's really no challenge at that point, or that's only where the challenge is, it starts to explain some of these differences. So it's not that, oh no, you always have to train full range of motion. And now all of a sudden we've changed everything, discarded all the old studies, and we think, no, you need to focus on, length and partials in some context, or length and partials just as good as full range of motion. So full range of motion has been, jettisoned as the idea or something that's important. It's that we understand why range of motion was was showing this outcome. And on that similar topic, the big meta-regression that recently came out on volume that seems to be really creating this struggle within people, there's multiple layered reasons for that. It's one, we tend to be binary thinkers. I want to know, is high volume better than lower volume? Put me in a camp. It's harder for my brain to hold on to the conditions when certain volumes can be better, and the concept of a nonlinear relationship where it's not just each increment produces an equal outcome. The idea of diminishing returns and then trying to think of, okay, I have to make a judgment as to when doing more volume is worth the time investment, the fatigue cost, the potential higher injury risk, while still accepting that higher volumes produce more hypertrophy, but not in a weighted way. Like if I have 10 sets, I have to double the amount of hypertrophy on average that I'll get from 10 sets, I have to go to 30. So that's a twofold increase to have, 3 times the investment in my training. Is that worth it? And that requires, of course, another level of thinking. But even that is embedded in how did the authors count volume? And here is a really useful one. So they used what's called a fractional counting method. They looked at all of the data out there on exercises, or rather, volume's impact on hypertrophy, and figured out, well, how do we count a set for the chest? And prior meta-analyses had said, you know what? Bench press, it's a set for every muscle involved. It's a set for the chest. It's a set for the triceps. And we have a few options here. We could continue that and just assume that that's the right way of looking at the world and trying to represent the data. Or we can actually see which model fits best. And they tried 3 different approaches. They tried that traditional way of looking at everything on equal footing. They tried the direct set only counting method where they went, it doesn't count for the triceps. And then they tried what people typically say is, a bench press does do something for your triceps, but probably not as much as a direct tricep exercise. Let's try counting it as a fractional set. Bench press is half a set for triceps. And they went, we can actually test that. And they did a statistical procedure of actually fitting those different representations to the data to see what actually best represented the real world observations. And there was a much better fit of the data, much less uncertainty when they used this fractional counting method. And I think kind of the first level interpretation for that is someone to go, okay, cool, now I know how to count my volume for triceps when I'm doing pressing work. But not only do you have to understand that, okay, the meta-analysis is counting bench press as half a set for triceps, you need to also understand that you don't literally get half as much stimulus from bench press for your triceps as you do a tricep pushdown, and that it's not literally true that an overhead press, a decline press, and a bench press produce exactly half a set of stimulus for your triceps. And it's also not literally true that every single tricep exercise is on equal footing and has the same stimulus, because we have studies that you have to look at where one tricep exercise, say an overhead extension compared to tricep pushdown, produce substantially more hypertrophy. And you're going, well, hold on, well, how can those both be true? Well, it depends. Like how zoomed out are you going to be? Or looking at averages. Do we understand the uncertainty? Okay, we've got a relationship, but how much of that relationship's variance is explained by those 2 variables? And you get to this point where for someone to be able to effectively use that knowledge in practice, you've got to figure out, okay, well, do I need to explain to them what an R-squared score is? Do I need to explain to them, at the very least, what the concept of variance is? Do I need to explain to them, like, the difference between a RCT and a meta-regression and what each one can tell me? And that is the challenge that I face. It's that if you don't understand these things, they just look like contradictory information or an oversimplification or a massive, overlooking by the scientists of even thinking about these things. And you get these very clear examples of the Dunning-Kruger effect where someone will go, well, how could the researchers not account for that? And not understanding that these things can be accounted for statistically, or they can be accounted for in a design. I had a very well-meaning educator who gave a presentation who I had to talk to, in like the subsequent panel. And I was like, well, the things you said they didn't account for, they didn't actually control for it, but the fact that they used it within participant design, or the fact that they used a sufficient sample and statistical analysis controls for those things. But if you need to have that explained to you and like sat down and point to the methods and go, oh, here's this section of stats for them to get it one-on-one with someone who's really well educated and is at the point where they're seen as an expert, imagine what you have to do with the typical consumer. And I'm not sure anyone has a great answer to that right now. And it's one of the biggest problems that I face personally when I'm trying to convince, or not even convince, just communicate science so people know how to use it. They can understand the study's findings. They can read the conclusion. But the amount of work that you have to do to get to the point where someone understands how these two pieces of information that seemingly conflict are actually contextualizing one another and enhancing your knowledge together versus just making you want to throw your toys and say, screw science altogether. That is a really difficult thing, Danny.
I want to go, if you don't mind, to a little bit more of a background version of what you're saying. In psychology, there's an entire discipline or field called the psychology of persuasion. And that was interesting to me. It was one of those moments, I think one of you mentioned, maybe you, Eric, like you had this moment of like, holy shit, I can't believe they actually did a study on that. Can't believe there's an entire field of psychology called the psychology of persuasion. When I was in the 7th grade, I did my first actual essay paper where you had to have citations and, it was kind of a big deal. I did it on automation, and that was around 1980. So automation was predicting that we would be working in a 3 or 4 day work week. We wouldn't have any more paperless offices, things like that. And one of the things they hinted toward was a service economy. And it just boggled my mind, like who would ever pay to have somebody else mow their lawn? Who would ever pay somebody else to do their laundry? Who would pay somebody else to change the oil in their car? Like, this is never going to happen. We're never going to be a service economy. Nobody's going to want to do that. And now, flash forward a couple iterations beyond that, we're in an information economy where most of us get paid directly or indirectly by communicating, by convincing other people to listen to us, by convincing other people, persuading other people that we are worth their time and attention. And I think that's why Danny and I share a little bit more of this pessimism, which is because we're all turning into salespeople, whether we want to be or not. To remain relevant or to support whatever you're doing, you have to be selling all the time. And some people are just going to do that in a very dishonest, unethical way because it is all about the sales. And some people are going to struggle because it's not very effective or not as effective selling normalcy, selling common sense. But I do think, at least my chosen business model or way to do this is not to create dissension and fights. That has become a much more normalized thing. I see people that I never thought would do this who have now made it their entire motif in social media just to do contradictory posts. Well, here, watch me listen to this idiot online and I'm going to make fun of them and tear them down and prove to you how smart I am. I much rather spend my time just putting out good information. Here's what's useful. Here's what has high utility. Here's what I think is correct based on all these nuances and contexts. Take it or leave it. I mean, I don't want to be in that position where I have to bend over backward to persuade you or convince you that I'm right. Here's the information. Here's my interpretation. Here's why I think it's relevant. We're moving on to something else. But I just don't want to wake up every day having that kind of contention or conflict in my life. And I just don't know how it's going to pan out for everybody because that is what sells best. But here we are.
Yeah, I actually remember coming across a study that measured, I think it probably is exactly in the field you're talking about, the psychology of persuasion, where they measured, they had similar factual statements that were made, but one was made correcting the statement that was incorrect, and the other one was just presenting the information on its own. And then they asked the people who read it or listened to it, I don't remember which, when I recall the study, to rate the rational and intelligence and the trustworthiness of the information. And they rated the person as more rational, intelligent, and trustworthy when they were correcting the other one. Oh, look, this guy's really smart. He can take this other guy down. So I think that's something we've seen play out in the evidence-based space for a long time, and it creates kind of this stigma of, God, these pedantic guys are so annoying, and the people who are kind of feel like they're in the other camp, like the I was just doing my thing, and this evidence-based guy popped up in my comments and made me feel like an idiot. And you see that the low-hanging fruit, that's been around for probably 2 decades, if not longer, on the internet, of the standard evidence-based person is I don't actually tell you what to do, I just tell you what not to do. You know, I'm here to just bust myth. I'm doing the whack-a-mole. And it's a good model because you've always got content, and there's only more of it now. You know, and it's also frustrating because I'm framing it negatively and like easy, and it's like you're taking the low win, but it's also necessary because there's so much pseudoscience out there. And I think, for example, like on Sigma Nutrition Radio, when you guys have done like the Quack Watch, and you've talked about like, hey, let's take this clip of someone making a claim and let's break it down and why that's an issue. That's actually a very useful service. So it is this challenging thing of, I don't necessarily want to have to bend over backwards and just basically be a slave to what other people say. You know, like, let me find someone who's stupid or lying or misrepresenting something so I know what I'm doing on Instagram on Tuesday, right? Like, that does sound terrible, and it makes me sick to my stomach, and I'm not going to be the one who does that. But damn it, if we don't need to actually look at what pseudoscientific trends are taking hold in the industry so we can provide a counter narrative to actually protect the consumer. And I think that is a very challenging thing to get right. And, you know, like, for example, the Sports Nutrition Association, it's like, okay, we're trying to provide this protection for the consumer and protection for the career of being a nutrition coach. How much of that involves policing and correction versus just doing a good job with the people who are with us? And sometimes it can feel like you're putting on the blinders to do the latter. And sometimes you might not be doing enough, or you could be doing more. And then you're also trying to balance your own mental health while you're on social media. If you do want to do the former, which might be better, because you have to engage with either the people themselves, the followers, the lashback, or, you know, the tribes, if you will, that get generated around these ideas and the identities that get involved. It's a challenging space to operate in.
I think it highlights, I totally agree that over time I'm more and more convinced that this idea of holding up, here are these myths that are out there, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, let's laugh at how wrong all this is a complete waste of time. It doesn't convince people who are convinced of that anyway, and people who are agreeing with you already know the correct position. What I think is useful is, as you highlighted, Erich, sometimes it can be useful to hold up a position that is really common nowadays, use an example of where someone would have heard it, that it sounds convincing, explain why that is convincing to them, but nevertheless the potential problems with it, and then as a route in to explain, here's what we know from the current evidence. And those two things I think are very disparate. I think just the constant pounding on things that are incorrect, just it wears away and is not going to be useful. So I think that's a losing strategy. One of the things that I really like that you said, Joe, because I often have this dread, but also realization as well, is that unfortunately everyone gets dragged into marketing in some way. And that might not be marketing a business, but I just mean of how people have to conduct themselves in an online space around information, of a way to get people to actually hear that message or see that message. And it moves further and further away from the good old days of domain expertise, right? And unfortunately, the problem you posed earlier, Erich, of for people who don't have the expertise to go through that one-on-one, how do we communicate some of these things? In an ideal world, that's where we have institutions with true experts and domain expertise that people can then trust, and they don't have to do that. But now it's kind of eroded, and a lot of the information structure does erode that now. So people are going and wanting to try and learn that for themselves. So I think that becomes a problem. One thing I would love to ask you about, Joe, and this might be some type of segue from our discussion around marketing, is that I recently saw some discussion where someone was mentioning that within large corporations, as an example, one of the problems they have this was a consultant talking about his work with them, said one of his problems was convincing that most of the marketing teams in these large organizations over-index and overspend on things that are easy to quantify, for example, conversions, and don't spend enough on things that are very difficult to quantify, like brand loyalty, as an example. And I think what's interesting, and to connect back to this trajectory you've talked about over the last number of decades in the industry, is that initially, at least in nutrition and physique sport, there was maybe this focus on, oh, eat these special foods, or here's the diet that someone else told me about. And there was no focus on quantifiable metrics or understanding some of these principles. And for listeners who don't know, you were probably the first, or at least the main person that popularized a lot of things that people take for granted now of, hey, you guys don't need to look at special foods. We can actually look at the carbohydrates, protein, and fats in these. We can have, once we have an understanding of these, we can have this flexible approach to dieting, things that is a cornerstone in most of the industry now. This was kind of one of the first people to make this known, and seeing, oh, there are some things that we can quantify that are going to be really useful. And I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how that maybe has changed now to the point where, because we're in this data-driven world where there's metrics and data for everything, there's an app for everything, that everyone is in on metrics. Have we gone perhaps too far to the point where it's so data-driven that people don't have that space or bandwidth for some of the ideas you've introduced in this discussion around social science, psychology, and so on, that are really at the fund in a coaching client relationship?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you my battle between Erich when we were trying to out old man each other, and give you that kind of answer, but then show you what I think is truly the more futuristic and appropriate answer. All of evolution is a trade-off. We're not the biggest, fastest, strongest animals on the planet, and every evolutionary move from Denisovans, Australopithecus afarensis to Homo sapiens, Homo erectus prior, like every physical manifestation or difference, even the post-orbital constriction that changed the shape of our prefrontal cortex or allowed it to change, like all of that has pros and cons. It's not all just pro. It's not all just advancing. You give something up. And psychologically and socially, as we get into these heuristics, it's because we're dealing with so much information every single day. And so perhaps my narrative for the last 10 years has been, look, 30 years ago when I created macronutrient-based tracking, it was to give you freedom. Like, it was all about getting away from rigid dieting and meal planning. How could you bastardize that and turn that into a form of rigidity itself? How did we become now hyper-focused and rigid on numerical data? Just move the goalposts. But now we're kind of going back to, well, okay, I need to know that information on macronutrient tracking so I can make the best decisions intuitively, because intuitive eating is going to be best conducted if it's based on some good factual information. I can't intuit that a Twinkie is just as good for me as a salad. I need to have some of that macronutrient information in my brain, maybe micronutrient information too. So that's my old man version. Like, you gotta learn the fucking shit. You gotta learn it, so then you don't have to use it as much. Like, it's already in your brain. You don't forget how to ride a bike. But the more futuristic answer is, we only have so many hours in the day. We only have so many interests we can really master. So if these heuristics become useful to me and I don't really need to learn all of that, well, maybe this app, maybe I am dependent on it, but maybe I'm okay. Maybe I'm just as successful. I don't change the oil in my car, going back to my previous metaphors, any longer. There are a lot of things I don't do anymore. I'm still okay. I'm still alive. It's working out. So some of these things that we think we have to do developmentally that worked for us 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, maybe they're not quite as necessary. But at some point, all of human behavior has to hit some kind of a social entropy. We can't have 40% obesity and 70% overweight stats until we just continue to die of heart disease. Like, something has to change, where at least some of those heuristics are very normalized. For example, in 1960, we were at about a 2% obesity rate, as was Japan. Japan is still at a 2% obesity rate. We're at 40%. Their social strata is simply now embedded with, we don't do certain things. We don't allow certain foods. We have cooks and chefs at every single school. We don't allow these foods to be, even brought into school. We give very early childhood education on health that continues on through adult levels. And so there, it's built in. It no longer has to necessarily be taught at the granular level that all three of us are interested in, because it's what we do occupationally. Maybe some of those apps and heuristics, do end up serving society better. But, we're kind of in the middle of this one, so we'll see.
That actually really reminds me. I remember, and I'm really not trying to make this the Old Man Remembers podcast, but it's becoming that. So right now, I'll start with the new stuff, so it doesn't sound that way. There's a debate in academia as to the utility of AI or the danger of AI, right? And the intelligent, accurate take is that it's neither. It's not one or the other, right? That in fact you are having to consider the benefits, the pros and cons in different circumstances. And I see my contemporaries who are doing an excellent job using AI to make their data better. They have a built-in, ChatGPT with R, and they can find errors in their code for their statistical analysis much more efficiently and make better, larger, more accurate data sets, right? Yet at the same time, you'll go to a seminar and they're talking about how do we deal with these papers that are largely written by ChatGPT, and this is an issue, yada, yada, yada. So what do we do? And how do we deal with that? And it reminds me of when I was being taught cursive when I was still in high school or even middle school, and the teachers were convinced, but you still need to have this skill. Or then when people were going, well, you need to be able to do these maths without having a calculator, And today we look back on that and we go, that really doesn't make sense, because everyone always has the equivalent of a calculator now. And I think as society advances, it is true, if there was a massive collapse and an apocalypse, we wouldn't have access to some of these things. But you can't set up society based upon a worst case scenario. Maybe you shouldn't until you need to. That's kind of the way insurance works, right? But I think it's just really interesting where we're not good at predicting what do we need and what can we, quote unquote, automate, like you were talking about. And it will be I think it's hard to predict where that will get to, as your story from your seventh grade essay in 1980 was telling. There was a lot of things that were accurate there. And I think some of it also, it's that we have, through the process of evolution as humans, there is, to some degree in everyone, anytime there's a change to our environment, we register it as a threat to some degree. And then we have to actually have the presence of mind to think rather than kind of react emotionally in our very kind of basal limbic system. Okay, is this helpful? Is this harmful? Is this really a threat? Or am I just registering a change? And is this something that could be a positive or a negative? And I think that is where we see a lot of these things stem from. And it's just I don't necessarily have a main point I'm making here. I just think it's very interesting when you frame things in that way. It's never just good or bad. You have to assess, can this be helpful, and what way will this be helpful? And if there is a tipping point where this becomes enough of a problem, things will change. And that's just something I think you have to be able to at least anticipate and be open to operate in the modern world.
I think to your point, Danny, the thing that's affected my coaching most in this regard is that now I'm so much more open-minded to trying to understand where a specific client is and saying, okay, here's where I think a really good starting point would be. We may experiment, we may have to change horses midstream at some point, but I don't necessarily have a process where it's we all have to start here. You must start at chapter 1 to get here. I probably did that 25 years ago. Because I was more ideologically driven in this is how we get this very important information in your brain and into your habit base. And now I just think we're at a place with technology that everybody can go in so many different directions that would be a little bit faulty on our end.
Yeah, I mean, it does. We're at a point now where I sometimes hesitate to ask about the future direction of anything, because everything is changing so quickly, and it's almost like, well, it's very difficult to predict anything. But maybe if we were to look at that short, almost immediate term, because a lot of people listening are working as professionals in the field of health and fitness or as nutrition. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Oftentimes the impulse is to almost an anxiety of, oh, well, everyone else is doing this. I need to keep up with this particular trend. And a part of that is probably true. People do need to make the most of this. But also it can be quite anxiety provoking for many professionals, sometimes at the detriment of their overall performance. As someone who obviously is still within the field, who does a lot of mentoring, that a lot of people are talking to about some of these problems, but also as an understanding of social sciences, and a broader context of society in general, is there anything that you would say to professionals at this time about where we are heading, particularly in the nutrition professional space, what some of the broader trends in society might mean for professionals here, and general things you might be able to point them in the right direction to ease some of that anxiety?
Yeah, I think a lot of the overwhelm when it comes to just too much information, too many voices, too little time in the day. More people, and this has been a trend that has been evolving in different ways for a long time. More people are looking for singular voices to take care of multiple problems. So I think it's much, much harder for somebody to be an online, it can happen obviously, but to be just an online coach. I think especially to break into the industry and create a base that is successful and thriving that you can then use as a platform to grow into other areas is to become a very good institutional resource in your own community. For you to be able to sit down, I'll give you an example. Just for fun, I've told Erich that he's living my dream. I just never, it just didn't happen in my career to go into academia, but I have for so long wanted to do that. And when I turned 55, I thought, okay, I'm getting close enough to retirement. If I do something different than what I've done for the last 30 years, it's basically going to be like stocking shelves at Barnes & Noble. Like I'm going to miss a period of my life. So at 55, I thought from 55 to 65 or so, that's kind of executive directorship, CEO level life experience. So just for fun, I have been sending out some resumes and speaking to some people, different schools in my area. And I sat down for an interview with a CEO of a nonprofit that would lead me into a position of doing more childhood literacy type work, a lot of things with underprivileged youth. And whether I do something like that part-time or full-time, I'm at least interested in seeing what's out there. This CEO wanted to take me to have coffee so we could talk. Other people are busy sending me notes back and forth, automated replies, got your resume, cool, we'll contact you in 6 weeks or this, look for this for your next step. This CEO wanted to take me out and have a sit-down meeting. And we connected so well, and we both walked away feeling so good about what we both could represent in this relationship. And I just thought how uniquely perfect that is in virtually every overlay of our lives, that the closer you get to somebody where you can build that intimacy and trust that quickly gives you every advantage in the world. So what would I say that coaches need to know who are trying to build a career and break out? The closer you can get to your audience, it also comes from a marketing principle by Seth Godin. He talks about the minimum viable audience. What good does 5 million viewers or audience members do if only 10 of them would really trust you enough to hire you? So you want the minimum viable audience. You want to connect with the most people who have deep, deep trust in you and really want to be in your orbit. And then you build from there. So that would be my first principle. of what the current social trends are and how to be a successful science communicator, service-oriented person as a coach is use technology, but use it to leverage yourself so you can get closer to your clients.
Fantastic. I think one of the things for me that reminds me, because I was having a conversation with a friend of this recently, is that, and it speaks to the point Erich made earlier about how everything always comes back around almost. And if people haven't been around, they don't realize that. And one of those things I think now is knowing a number of people are having tremendous success in the industry by going completely against online coaching and deciding, hey, I'm going to stop doing my online coaching, or I'm going to wind that down maybe, starting to do more stuff in person, maybe deciding to go into a brick and mortar facility, the quote unquote traditional way. But now that is almost the advantage because there's so many online coaches. And as you noted, there are so many people now for the first time really in the industry that have only ever done online coaching. And so for someone then to turn around and say, hey, I'm a coach at this particular facility, or I'm starting this place, it's certainly not super rare, but it's also a distinct selling point. And it is something that brings a whole host of other skills and is a whole other area that sometimes people don't think about because of this sometimes obsession that we can get from seeing messages online around the need to scale everything immediately, and anything where you're trading your time for hours is a complete waste of time. Well, again, as we spoke with science, depends on the context, depends on the situation, and a whole host of other factors as opposed to one thing being right. So I think that just triggered off that thought that some of these areas that used to be the traditional routes are actually really viable now as well for a lot of people, while merging in the best of what technology and the online space has to offer as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Joe. I think that's a really important point for anyone who is trying to serve people. If you get too caught up in some of the stuff that Danny was just talking about, of scalability and reach, and kind of looking at just how do I get my stuff to go viral, you need to make sure that that's actually what you need and what you want and the best way to deliver. If you're actually trying to get a full roster, but not an overwhelming roster where it degrades the quality of work of clients who trust you and you can have a very impactful influence on their lives, you need to be in their lives. It's not necessarily the same game as trying to reach as many people as possible, say with a podcast or a infographic. But some of the same concepts underlie both. We have to think about, all right, if we're making great points an hour and 20 minutes into this podcast, how do I get someone to actually not only want to listen to the podcast, but stick around for the majority of it? And to some degree, the medium kind of self-selects for that. But at the same time, we also have to think about how the information is delivered, how consistent are we, and how do you build that following over time who trusts you and says, you know what, I want to spend an hour and a half with Danny Lennon. I want to spend an hour and a half with Dr. Joe, and I want to feel like I can have this in-depth conversation. That is something that I think about all the time, because a lot of what I do is I'm asking people to engage with long-form content and have trust in my interpretation. And if I lose sight of that, what I do on social media is whatever that platform says is the best way to gain a following. And then you can find yourself in this disconnect. And I think a lot of nutrition coaches do this, is they will play the game on the platform effectively, and they can grow a very disengaged audience. You might have a lot of followers, but none of them are actually wanting to hire you as a coach or, become a member of your research review, because what you do online doesn't sell yourself as that. It says, hey, I've got these cool hot takes, and great, that might grow you on Instagram. But I can tell you from having done a lot of affiliate marketing over time, I've seen when there's a mismatch here and just how stark the differences can be. Someone might do a fantastic job on Instagram. They might have 500,000 followers and they're all fitness related. And you're thinking, man, and they're even maybe science adjacent or science interested, or they promote science. You think, oh, they would be just a whale for me to get if they became maybe one of my affiliates on my books or for mass. And then they make the post and nothing happens. And it's because their audience has not been curated to go, hey, would you like to read a 200 reference, like 300-page book? Or would you like every month to get a master's thesis in your inbox to read on various nutrition topics? They're like, no. Like, I want to get some quick tips that I can take into the gym, today. And I have a busy life. What are you, crazy? Like, I'm not following you because I want to read a master's thesis every week. So I think that is the only thing I would add to contextualize what Dr. Joe said, is just think about, what does your public-facing image need to be to achieve those outcomes in your career? And it may not be what many of these kind of social media marketing gurus tell you it needs to be. They are experts in helping you blow up a following on social media, and that may or may not be the best way to get those clients. And even if, let's say, you do blow up so much that you only need a 1% conversion rate or less from the people who are interested in what you do, you end up having to re-educate the people who do convert because they're expecting something different than you're actually giving them. So I've seen that problem happen as well, kind of behind the scenes in certain coaching companies, where they blow up by marketing the transformation. Here before and after pictures. It really works well, but it's also kind of selling yourself as a product, not a service. It has very little to do with the relational aspects. They don't really understand who you are. They just see the results. And absolutely, you take people who want a change and are on the market for coaches, and you show them, listen, I have better transformations than someone else. They will go, sweet, I can't wait for that coach to do that transformation for me, because that's basically how you're marketing yourself. And then when you communicate with them and you're asking them all these questions, and you don't just have a magical formula and a cookie cutter diet that works better than all the other cookie cutter diets out there for them, they get frustrated with you. And you have to, then you find yourself that, you've got a high conversion rate or a high enough conversion rate off of your marketing strategy, but you have a low retention rate because what you're delivering is not what they're expecting. So that's the only other piece that I would add to Dr. Joe's great advice. I think this has been a really great conversation. I think people will hopefully understand a couple key points. One, that was really early on that I want to remind everyone of, is that if something truly is a game changer, and it's happened multiple times and come up and gotten popularized multiple times in the last couple decades and hasn't changed the game, well, you know right away that it's not a game changer. And the second point I would have is just to be aware of how the world evolves and the direction it's going to go in, and what structures and incentive systems promote that, and then be able to adapt to that and understand that for every gimme, there's a gotcha. Like evolution is not only purely positive, and also understand that you're going to have a reaction to change. I think for me, something that's really helped me stay sane as that's gone on and not become alarmist or pessimistic or overly optimistic, despite you both thinking I had rosy-colored glasses on, is to kind of just be self-aware. And when I have an emotional response to societal changes, go, all right, why do I feel this way? And what is at the root of this? Is this just me being afraid for the understanding of reality I have changing, and that giving me a sense of existential unease? Or is there a real logical thing here that I need to respond to and potentially adapt with, or provide a counter-narrative to, if I think it is just a fad? So those are the last things I have to say. You guys crushed this podcast, and I want to ask if there's anything else either one of you want to add before we close this one out.
I would just say, I don't want to open another can of worms because I think it's an entirely different podcast, but what resonated with Danny, and then you picked the ball up and ran, was this business is hard work. The ideology is the easy part, so to speak. I think a lot of coaches jump on to information like this, and they think, as long as I believe the right things and I post the right things, I'm going to have a thriving business. And it goes nowhere, because business is business. It takes very hard work. It takes understanding some of these principles of what is hitting in the market, what is not, where is culture going, and then just the difference between things like sales and marketing, the ideology or the conceptual versus what you will actually do as a service model. So that's kind of the disillusionment I see a lot of times with coaches who think they have everything to be successful, and then they just still can't get off the ground.
Only thing I will add is first, a huge thank you to you, Joe, for sharing your thoughts with Erich and I. It's been fantastic to hear your insights on a range of topics here. I'm sure people will have really enjoyed that. Erich, it's a pleasure as always. A big thank you to the regular listeners of Sigma Nutrition, and for any of the Iron Culture listeners, just be very wary of Erich's positivity propaganda and his optimism. Don't fall for it. We're all doomed. As you would have seen now, Omar's gone, and it's going to continue going down and down.
That is too good.
Well said, Danny. I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm very positive about that. Folks, thank you so much for listening to another episode of whatever 5 podcast this is. Please do us a favor on whichever of the 5 platforms you might be listening to it on. Give us a rating, give us a review, give us a like, whatever is appropriate. Insert appropriate way of helping us grow engagement and growth here. And we will catch you in that next episode. Insert date here.